This is a particularly timely moment to be considering these topics. Just this week, NOAA released a report saying that 39% of the U.S. population is concentrated in coastal counties along the shoreline, and if current population trends continue as we've seen them, these coastal communities will increase from 123 million to nearly 134 million just by 2020. So we're putting more and more people in harm's way. And 2 days ago, New York State listed climate change as a risk for bondholders. And earlier, the state proposed a $400 million buyout program for waterfront homes in high-risk areas. The new National Climate Assessment that we can expect to be in final form later this spring warns that sea level rise, more intensified storms, and increasing coastal development are on a collision course. Given all of that, I'd like to kick off our panel discussion with Cass Holloway and ask you, Cass, to talk a bit about New York City's their 2020 commission and its support for green versus gray infrastructure and the state buyout program that I mentioned. In the context of these results, how do these results inform your thinking about the policies that you've already developed, and how will you think differently about those policies?
Wow. Well, that's broad. First, let me start by saying thank you very much for having me here. This is a really distinguished panel. It's great to be a part of on behalf of Mayor Bloomberg, and great to be at the National Press Club today. Also would like to say thank you for this hugely important and valuable work. Communications are absolutely critical in all aspects of both climate change, preparing for it, preparing for the potential consequences of it, both in a medium and long-term sense, but also in an immediate sense. I am Deputy Mayor for Operations, actually in addition to working on many of the strategies for what do we do post-Sandy and how does it align with what we were doing before Sandy, but also been nearly complete on an after-action review of the city's performance during Sandy and the immediate response. And so just to give you some basic facts, the estimate that we have is that Sandy did about $19 billion of damages to New York City. That breaks into a bunch of different categories. 43 people lost their lives, tragic. However, because we took action to evacuate, it turns out 35 of those deaths were in the flood zone and were by drowning. And so they were people who, for one reason or another, didn't evacuate, and we know some of them chose not to evacuate. But that's all about communications. One of the questions that we are looking at as part of this review is, why do people leave or not, even when they are asked about a direct threat? Now, you can say, well, do they associate it with climate change? I think there's an important connection with communications all around on this subject because people are informed by what happened before. So we had Hurricane Irene. One of the questions, does that help or hurt that Irene broke up right before it hit New York City and many people evacuated? Well, we know a lot of people evacuated during Irene and then decided not to evacuate. Some people, one person that we asked, we know they were burglarized during Irene, so they didn't leave during Sandy. And then they were evacuated post-storm. So just to bring home the importance of these issues, it's really valuable. So in terms of trying to pick an area to focus on with the city, first, climate change is something that the mayor in particular and the city has been not only thinking about but investing in dealing with for years, at least since 2007 when Plan YC, the city's sustainability green print, so to speak, was released. It's an individual chapter. If you look at that chapter in 2007 of this massive 200-page tome of sustainability strategies, there is a chapter on climate change, and it actually has charts showing what projected surge levels at the battery would be. And in fact, if you look at the mapping, and I was reviewing the update in preparation for this, the inundation areas for FEMA's 100-year flood zone and 500-year flood zone that were done in 1983 and hadn't been updated since then and are only being updated now match in a way that is, well, you can call it gratifyingly accurate or scary, depending on your perspective, what Sandy actually did. And so it turns out that those projections, they were in the process of being updated. Now it's even more urgent that that happen. So the vulnerability of the city is clearly real to intensified storms, rising sea levels. And so we've been thinking about and investing in strategies to mitigate that. There are two ways to do it, obviously. One is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and on the mitigation side, you know, the city's committed to doing a 30% reduction below 2006 baseline levels by 2030. But then there's a whole adaptation side. We've been investing in energy retrofits. Our Department of Environmental Protection, I was commissioner there for the first 2 years of the third term, and during that period we implemented a green infrastructure plan. The whole point of that plan is to make the city more permeable so that it can actually absorb the increased precipitation that you're going to get with climate change. And so there's a tremendous amount of investment that has been happening. What Sandy does is it focuses and requires the acceleration of actual investments, not just planning and thinking, but actual investments in for individual homeowners at the building level, which the survey talks about. And then what do you do about coastal protection? Who pays for it? And what are the right measures to take? So all of those things are on the table, and you're going to see in May a strategic document that is really in line with the PlaNYC planning process. We have a group of 30 professionals working on this that is looking at those general questions and going to make recommendations for the investments that we can make. And the good news is, thanks to the Sandy relief package, we're also going to be able to make a down payment on those investments in addition to the city investment that we've been making.
So if I could just follow up on that, in terms of ability to pay and public sentiment about who should pay, the National Climate Assessment, one of the key findings is that we have real disparities in the socioeconomic vulnerability of communities that are in high hazard areas. You see that yourself in New York, where in Manhattan you have relatively well-to-do businesses and individual property owners, and then in the Rockaways you have highly vulnerable populations, the elderly, the institutionalized, minority populations. How do you think about that difference in terms of this study, the results we see, and what the American people think should be the answer to who should pay, and the role of the local government, state government, and federal government in actually paying for reducing their vulnerability?
Well, I think that first, it's not a surprise that that people will express concern and maybe in principle, as you said during the study, to deal with an issue but then not want to pay for it, or want other people to pay for it. The mayor, talks about that in a lot of different contexts. To me, a very interesting fact from the work that was presented is that I think it was 62 or 67% favor changing building codes, and that makes sense with the point of view that businesses and people who are in coastal areas should pay to internalize those risks, because if the building code requires that you make certain investments, fundamentally it's the private or even the public sector internalizing the risk as it builds, if you're going to build a business on the coast or build a home on the coast. And so that aligns quite nicely. And if you look at we have made a lot of changes in New York City's building code for stormwater, energy efficiency, at least getting a lot of information and requiring people to do assessments in the hope that just the creation of the assessment data itself will inform people's investment decisions on a private basis. So there's a lot that is already happening, and if our green infrastructure plan, for example, is a $1.5 billion of public spending over the next 20 years, and then we anticipate, based on projections, $900 million of private development. We changed the stormwater code and increased by an order of magnitude the amount that businesses and homeowners have to manage in terms of stormwater capacity on the property, and that means we anticipate that about $900 million of private investment will be made in basically making the city more permeable. So that is not a surprise. Now, the thing is, and New York City is probably one of the most acute examples of this, 75% of the building stock that's in New York City now, or 60 or 75%, is going to be there in 30 years. Even if you have a massive development boom, as you did in the early aughts, so to speak, you're only going to turn over in 10, 20 years, 10, 15% of that stock in a meaningful way, even through retrofits. So the question is, what do you do with the coastal communities that are there? Well, the facts on the ground show some interesting stuff. Many of the houses that were most badly damaged, first of all, homes were the things mostly badly damaged by Sandy. Single-story homes built before 1983 were the homes that were disproportionately damaged relative to their representation in the housing stock. And it was really not until the 80s and 90s that the cities, first of all, that the flood insurance program came into being. Secondly, that the city's building code ultimately required that base flood elevation be taken into account when you build a place. And so it's not surprising in a way that things that were built in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, not built to those standards, were not prepared for that, the inundation that Sandy caused. If you look at some of the neighborhoods that have come up just in the last 10 years, Queens East, Hunters Point South, a bunch of the areas that we have rezoned, upzoned, and that the mayor has invested in building, they fared very well. Even places in the Rockaways, Auburn by the Sea, which is in mid-Rockaways, and people should go there and take a look at it as a prime example of a private developer making a place more resilient. They lost power. I mean, making things, taking account of climate change doesn't make it climate-proof. I mean, I think things will flood and wind will damage things. The question is, how quickly can you get it back up online? How, when people come back, what's left? And I think the answer is that things that have been built later and built to those standards fared much better, and I don't think there's a suggestion or a need to retreat. I also think the data shows there, interestingly, from my perspective, people don't want to retreat as a general matter. And so that's why one of the guiding principles of our plan is to rebuild, but rebuild smartly. Rebuild and take the latest data into account. In fact, we're looking at, you're going to see projections from us going forward, because even the new advisory base flood elevation maps are really based on historical data. They do not project forward what the floodplain is going to look like in 2050. So I hope I covered some of the ground.
Thank you. Yeah. Moving to Laurie, if we can shift from the built environment to the natural environment, and if you could share with us what your research has shown in terms of the natural capacity of our natural coastal ecosystems to provide coastal protection and to actually afford us a little bit of breathing room against climate change. I think we'd appreciate knowing that. And if you can be as specific as possible about the research findings and the role of intact coastal ecosystems.
Thank you, Meg, and thanks to both you and John Krosnick for doing this work. It's really helpful to have these kinds of information about public attitudes to really help us shape our thinking. I can't say that the timing of this couldn't be better because absolutely weather and extreme events, climate-related events are having a huge impact on the coast and have great costs associated with them. And as you well point out, more people are living on the coast. So figuring out how we deal with sea level change and extreme weather events is critically important. What we're finding and what we've seen at NOAA is that natural systems, kind of those nature's benefits, ecosystem services, really do provide a benefit to the built environment as well as the resilience of those natural systems. I might just tell a little story about New Jersey that we work with a research reserve there that's run through Rutgers University, and they've been working with towns, communities on the New Jersey shore for many years. And they're actually sort of a tale of two towns, right adjacent to one another. One that had more protection of their dune system prior to the storm, and the very adjacent town that did not. And you saw a real difference in the damage that was caused to the built environment based on an intact dune system versus a system that was not. And it's really not just about dunes, it's also about the marsh and the tidal marsh environment in the back bays, because in New Jersey, I think they experience between 6 and 10 feet of storm surge flooding on the backside of the barrier islands. And where there were more intact marsh systems, you actually saw less damage to those shoreline communities on the backside of the island or on the mainland. So we actually have anecdotal evidence for how those systems really are very helpful. So sort of from a policy standpoint, what NOAA's been doing is we've worked with the Department of Interior and with state agencies, Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies and Tribes, to develop a national fish, wildlife, and plants climate adaptation strategy. It's the first nationwide strategy. And so looking at what can you do to retain these natural systems, the traditional things like protecting habitat and managing species, but also thinking about how you educate the public about the importance of these systems, and how you reduce other non-climate stressors, those things that we've been spending decades trying to deal with stormwater impacts, water quality impacts, to try to give those natural systems a chance to be resilient to climate changes. So those are some of the things that we've been working on.
So given the anecdotal evidence that you've gleaned from Sandy and other storms, which there is some research for to back that up, what do you think the role of our coastal zone management program can be and should be moving forward? I mean, this is a federal program that allows coastal states to really kind of decide for themselves how they want to develop their coastlines. And is there a role for CZMA to actually facilitate and encourage the protection of these natural systems and even the restoration of these natural systems?
Absolutely. Thank you for pointing that out. The Coastal Zone Management Act has been in existence since 1972, and it's a partnership between NOAA and states to try to comprehensively manage coastal areas. So, as you well know from California, the authorities are state authorities, and NOAA provides support to encourage those comprehensive management of state coastal areas. So it forms a basis through what historically has been management of hazards, coastal hazards, and the protection and restoration of natural systems through those state policies. The program that I work with, Estuarine Research Reserves, provides the research and science basis for those policies. So coupling those two things together, you can do the science that helps you understand how are natural systems keeping up with sea level change, how are they responding to climate change, and then that helps policymakers decide how to incorporate that into their policies. So my hope is that we can use that and create some incentives and an opportunity to educate at both the state and the local level about what some of those adaptation alternatives are.
Okay, so now that we're on this national theme, Maggie, I'd like to turn to you and have you say a little bit about how the National Flood Insurance Program and Disaster Recovery Program that we have going right now squares with the results of this survey in terms of who should pay.
Thanks, Meg. I'm going to pull this closer because I have a very soft voice. If you can't hear me, please wave wildly, and I will try to speak louder. At the outset, I feel it's important I should say I have not worked with the National Flood Insurance Program, but did study it quite extensively in my dissertation work. The National Flood Insurance Program works on a community basis, so essentially communities have to adopt particular types of floodplain management regulations, and once they do, residents in the community can buy into the program. Historically, the National Flood Insurance Program has been pretty roundly criticized for two things. One is failing to set actuarial premiums. As Cass already mentioned, NFIP has traditionally used backward-looking data, so historical events, to project what flood zone you sit in. The Biggert Waters Flood Insurance Reform Act, which was passed in 2012, has some measures for improved mapping that seem to suggest that future projections of sea level rise should be incorporated into future maps. But the updating of the flood insurance rate maps or firms is a rather lengthy process, so it's not clear sort of when and how that will catch up. The second thing that has chronically been a problem with NFIP itself is that there is an extensive system under the original NFIP of premium grandfathering. So if you had a structure that was built before 1972, you weren't really subject to the requirements of the program. And in addition to that, if the area you lived in were remapped into a higher risk area, you were able to claim the lower premium from before. So what that's resulted in is a system that is a bit is insolvent on its face, because the premiums that are being paid into NFIP are lower than the liabilities to which it's exposed. We saw this with another number of hurricanes, and NFIP currently has a very substantial debt. One of the interesting things in the current Flood Insurance Reform Act is that NFIP has to make a plan to pay that back over the course of 10 years. It's a little bit unclear how that's going to happen because Sandy has added over another $10 billion, I don't know what the exact number is, to that debt of the program. Now, coupled with NFIP, there's a program called the Stanford Disaster Relief Program, which provides disaster relief to people in communities that have flood insurance. And the net effect of NFIP and Stanford has been to rebuild communities exactly where they are, historically without a lot of attention to making them more resilient. So the programs are designed to put a community back right like it was before the storm event. I think the other thing that's really important in terms of the context of these survey results is this question of who pays. Because NFIP rates have been low, NFIP claims have been paid out by drawing upon the general treasury, and in addition, Stafford relief comes from the general budget as well. So what that means is that coastal communities that have assumed a lot of natural hazard exposure and the risks associated there with it have had an ability to externalize that risk to the entire federal tax base, and so we're all paying for it. And I think that that's really interesting in the context of the survey results, because these survey results suggest that what you need is perhaps a system that's a bit more rigorous and has higher premiums so that those costs are truly borne by the individuals who are assuming the risks.
And I'm personally curious, getting back to places like New York, what the state role might be in the insurance world. In the whole arena of property insurance, we know that states serve as regulators of insurance companies, and isn't there an opportunity there to pull a lever?
So there is, and some states are doing some really interesting things. New York, California, and Washington have recently required that private insurers start to disclose what their plans for climate change are and how climate change will impact their business. However, the state role as a regulator of insurance creates some real tensions and has caused states to also assume a role in taking on this risk. So many state insurance commissions try to keep premiums from getting too high, and we've seen, particularly in the Gulf states, wind risk pooling, hurricane risk pooling. In Florida, after Hurricane Andrew in 1992, the private insurers went to the states and they said, we cannot afford to write insurance here anymore at the premiums that you want. And the state said, we don't want you to raise the premiums. And so they established this bond program called the Florida Hurricane Catastrophe Program, or the Florida Hurricane Catastrophe Fund. And what that fund does is it allows the insurers to underwrite as much hurricane insurance as people in Florida care to buy. They keep the tranche of the risk that they're comfortable keeping. They pass the rest on to the state, and it's paid for by state bonds. The Florida Hurricane Catastrophe Program is really overexposed. It makes this whole state budget very vulnerable. In 2008, the state of Florida actually came to Congress seeking a letter of credit in case they needed to draw upon the Hurricane Catastrophe Fund beyond its capacity to pay for hurricane disaster relief. So you see some kind of mixed dynamics going on at the state level, but I think that there seems to be a strong sense that as a policy goal, it's desirable for everybody to be insured. But if insurance is too expensive, people are unlikely to buy it. And so states are also getting caught in the middle and assuming a lot of risk that people can't pay for that would otherwise be uninsurable.
Carroll, moving to you. From a national think tank's perspective, I'm really curious to hear from you where you see the biggest opportunities for national policy given these results.
In terms of thinking about policymakers, I think, first of all, that this kind of information is so important in terms of beginning to empower policymakers to act. Many times we have seen that policymakers are the last ones to act. They have to feel that indeed the climate, the political climate for action is ripe. And that, while many of us who've been looking at climate for many years may feel that we should have reached that point long ago, at the same time, they really, I think, there have been many tensions, many concerns that have been raised, which John also talked about, that have prevented a lot of action from going forward. While there have been well, and let me just say that I think that now, after we got through the election, after we saw what happened with Sandy, I think that we have seen a difference in tone on Capitol Hill with regard to talking about climate, in terms of thinking about what we need to do, what the impacts upon our communities are, the fact that we, regardless of what one may think, we are seeing very real things that have to be addressed, because this is happening in so many people's states and districts across the country. While this concentrated on coasts, we have seen huge increases in the number of extreme weather events and droughts and flooding across the country, which are exacting a lot of economic costs, but also horrific human costs and disturbances. And I think those are really starting to reach home for many policymakers. So I think that that we are seeing changes in leadership, more people willing to speak up, to say that we need to address this. There was legislation that was introduced late last year, and we expect to be reintroduced this year, called the Strong Act, and that legislation, which Senator Gillibrand will be the lead on that. She and Senator Lautenberg and Senator Kerry, who's not state, had introduced legislation last year, but this is really to look at kind of partnerships in terms of the federal government and state governments, as far as looking at how we address greater resilience for our communities and what kind of information is needed and how we can go about that. So I do think that there are important opportunities. I do think that the time is now. And I think this work is so important in terms of helping people feel more comfortable in terms of moving.
So, Carroll, do you think there's a window of opportunity to revisit our national flood insurance program and disaster relief program?
Yes, I absolutely think that there is. How long it will take to do that or whatever, I certainly am not willing to prognosticate on that. However, I think that we're going to see lots more discussions about all of these issues, that there will be hearings. We have done some briefings. We plan to do more. I think a lot of other people are. So I definitely think that there are a lot of discussions already underway on the Hill with regard to some of these issues. I might just mention that we did a briefing in December where we brought in people from the reinsurance industry to look at their perspectives with regard to extreme weather events, what this means in terms of thinking about costs, how they're thinking about the future, because all of this really has to be looked at and understood by policymakers as we think about how we move forward, because the costs are profound. The package, the recovery package, was about $60 billion, I believe, the relief package. There is a lot of concern in terms of where's this money going to come from? How many times can we do this? when at the same time we hear over and over again, we have to deal with spending, we have to deal with the debt, and yet these are very, very real things happening across the country. So I think these are going to get a lot of very serious discussion this year.
And just on that note, I just note with some of my research colleagues, we found it very difficult to uncover the repeat loss data. And I'm just wondering if any of you have some insights on that and how we can bring more transparency to these federal programs that are really large ticket items.
That's an issue that we're really interested in looking at and actually putting together a forum to discuss that on the Hill, and because we think that it's really important to look at what the insurance and reinsurance industry is saying with regard to costs, to talk to state insurance regulators about that. Certainly the whole role of New York City. Mayor Bloomberg has been incredible in terms of his leadership, I think, and how he has raised these issues and put hard discussions and also solutions on the table. And so I think that, we've got to ask these questions of FEMA, bring them in, look at all of that, and look at costs that are not being covered, and we need to get that from state agencies as well.
Okay, Maggie, yes.
I think with respect to repetitive loss properties, it's also important to note that FEMA has had a grant program to deal with severe repetitive loss properties for a few years. And then in addition to that, in the 2012 Flood Insurance Reform Act, it was one of the areas where Congress did take some pretty substantial action to require people who have severe repetitive loss properties to accept certain types of mitigation assistance or to face very severe premium increases, and that severe repetitive loss properties will be taken out of this premium grandfathering scheme. And that's really, really important because when you look at the statistics, they account for a very, very significant portion of the National Flood Insurance Program payouts.
Great. So I'm going to open it up now for questions. Yes, Seth? To any panelist, or all of them.
This is for Cass, Seth Bornstein, AP. You talked about the Sandy changing everything from sort of just talking about things to actually doing things on adaptation. New York has been criticized because you had the plan in 2007 and actually very little was done. Can you expound a little? I mean, because we listened, some of us in the press listened 2 days ago to the Fish and Wildlife Service release their grand adaptation plan for wildlife, and it had absolutely no details. And so I guess one of the criticisms about adaptation plan is it's grandiose, except for it doesn't do anything, doesn't give any money, and has no details. You're saying Sandy changed that for you. Can you get a little more specific, and do you think it will take Sandy's elsewhere to change it for the rest of the country?
Well, I want to start just by correcting one thing, which is that it is not the case that it's been all planning and no acting. Since Plan YC was released in New York City, we've invested hundreds of millions of dollars in energy retrofits in all the rezonings that we've done. We've incorporated, and these are for city-financed public housing projects, as well as not just public housing, but affordable housing projects, ensuring that the elevation, that those are elevated, and there are, in terms of the green infrastructure plan and making the city more permeable, that's $1.5 billion. So it is not the case by any stretch that Sandy was, we were awake. It was not a wake-up call. But certainly now that you are faced with two issues. One is many people in the communities that were hit the hardest are devastated, and they need assistance now, and they need to make decisions about rebuilding now. And that is something that creates an opportunity for us to accelerate both the thinking about and implementation of what the standards are going to be. And so I think that going forward, though, what we're looking at is with the community development block grant funding and the things that the city is putting in place, we are putting programs in place for people to be able to mitigate as they rebuild. Think about this. The new advisory-based flood elevation maps double the number of structures that are within the floodplain for New York City. from 35,000 to approximately 70,000. Now, these questions about the National Flood Insurance Program are going to be are very urgent in New York City now, because people are looking at bigger waters and what it is going to require. And this is not, on the one hand, people are applauding the fact that it is moving the flood insurance program to an actuarially based insurance structure. However, if you look at one of the interesting pamphlets that FEMA produces, if you are not at the base flood elevation under the new advisory-based flood elevation maps, you could be facing a premium of $10,000 a year for your flood insurance. Now, if you suddenly find yourself in the floodplain and the question becomes, well, I need to elevate in order to take advantage of, now if you are 2 to 3 feet above the advisory-based flood elevation, that premium is $427. This is just an illustration that they have. You can get this online. That's great. But in a city like New York City, where you have thousands of structures that where elevation is not practical, or it could be done, but the cost of elevating would far exceed the return on that. The question is, what strategies are going to count for mitigation? And I think that a one-size-fits-all approach isn't going to work. And so one of the things that we are looking at as part of the work we're doing, and we've been working very closely with FEMA, and we have National Flood Insurance Program experts looking at this. I think you'll see some proposals from the administration about ways that we think adjustments are going to need to be made in order for there to be a practical and reasonable application of mitigation strategies that you're going to be able to spread over the widest body. One of the core questions is going to be, do we spend a tremendous amount of money helping a very small percentage of people become essentially climate proof, or is that money better spent maybe not going all the way in terms of elevating all of the every single property, but doing elevating mechanicals and other things. But the question is, right now, that might not get you the premium relief, and if it doesn't, it might not even enable you to spend the money, the government money on the community development block grant funding. And so these issues are quite urgent, and we're going to be looking at them for their practical implications now.
Yeah, right here.
Hi, James Arnott with the Aspen Global Change Institute. I think there was an important point in one of the slides that Lauren provided showing the wide range of scenarios that future climate change could, or there was a scenario for emissions, but that would imply what future climate change would be. And so when we're talking about adapting to climate change, adapting to what is a very broad range, and depending on our mitigation strategy over the next 100 years, that will have dramatic implications for our adaptation strategy. And so I'd like anyone to weigh in on what do the recent survey results, as well as the kind of climate we're in post-Sandy, imply for this interaction between mitigation and adaptation in a more cohesive conversation, whereas in the past they've been entirely separate.
Go ahead, Laurie.
Just like to mention a couple of things. What we've been trying to do at NOAA, and I'll be really interested to see if you can help shed some light on how visualizations help with planning. But for sea level change, we have sea level viewers, which enable decision makers and the public to look at that range of sea level change and what it actually looks like on the landscape as you project from a 1 foot to a 6 foot change in sea level, and how that's going to affect communities, and in some cases also coupled that with visualizations that are more like your Google map, street view, where you can actually see what would the water look like here, here, and here. So that at least gives folks a way to visualize that range and variation, and so the kinds of responses that different communities and states are going to do, they're going to figure out how much risk they can either afford or can absorb in those various adaptation strategies. But at least you have a way to see what those things mean, as opposed to just this very amorphous global number of, it's 8 inches or it's 6.6 feet.
Any other panelists want to respond to that? Yeah, Cass.
I think that mitigation and adaptation, I think you're right to observe that there are those who are focused on mitigation of greenhouse gases and the global warming effect. And there does need to be a more integrated look at the strategies. I mean, take New York City. We are responsible for 0.6% of worldwide global greenhouse gas emissions. Now, cities are responsible for, or projected to be responsible for, 80% of worldwide global greenhouse gas emissions. And so things like the C40 that the mayor's now the chair of and are really bringing those big cities together to say what are the levers that local governments have to reduce greenhouse gases, and can we, by working together, take actions that may be at a wider, for the United States, at the federal level, can't be taken or won't be taken. And that is having a tremendous impact. That is tremendously important. But sea level has risen a foot over the last 100 years on the coastline of New York. And if you just look at the weather events and the frequency of extreme weather events, it's definitely increasing, and so the impacts are here. And I think you can't look at these things as one or the other. Now, we have a strategy that I think lays both things out. If you can look online at nyc.gov at the Plan YC strategy, and as I've said, more to come. I personally think that one of the things that I hope doesn't get lost in all of this is what Sandy has done is it's gotten everybody to focus intensively on the storm. And the fact is that the risks and impacts of climate change go far beyond that. And in fact, the likelihood that you're going to have a storm that had the precise characteristics of Sandy, which for lots of reasons was a worst case scenario, just in terms of its trajectory, the northwest winds hitting the city because of the other weather front that made it hook back. Normally, if you're going up the northeast coast, just the winds that are likely to be, the wind-facing side of the storm that's likely to hit the city would be much less damaging. And Category 1, when you're in there's all kinds of reasons why, it was a worst-case scenario. It could happen again. But one thing that we know is happening is every single summer, even since the recession, we've had higher and higher peak load days of power usage in New York City. The projection is that right now you have 14 days a year that are 90 degrees or more in New York City. That number could go up to 25 by the 2020s and 60 by the 2080s. What does that mean? Well, once you have 2, 3, 4 days, the strain that it puts, also given the urban heat island effect, on the grid really opens you up to the risks of brownouts, blackouts, and then that creates all kinds of public health issues, some of which we saw during Sandy because we had an extensive power outage. Then there were also threats to the water supply from the increased storms that make it so that you can't use large portions of the water that you might have in storage. So all of those things have to be considered and all require resources. And the allocation of those resources has to be spread across all of those potential risks. If you throw everything into protecting against the storm and the storm doesn't come, but the heat does.
Yes.
Ken Meyer, Court Roll Docs. The average global temperature has not gone up in over a decade now. If this plateauing continues for another decade or two, what do you suppose the impact on people's views on climate adaptation will be?
I'm happy to address that, and I will actually this afternoon at the EESI briefing. I think you're making a very interesting point that is of great relevance, according to our research, among a subset of the American public who watch very carefully what happens to average world temperature year by year. And so, for example, there are many people in that community who are very aware that 2010 was at the time the warmest year on record for the world, and that 2008 was tied for the coolest year on record for the world during a 10-year period. And that, I think you're pointing your finger at a very important, relevant stream of data. So in other words, if one is asking the question, is climate change happening? Is CO2 emissions or greenhouse gas emissions causing the planet to warm over a 10-year period? if there are ups and downs around a general trend, what impact does that have on public opinion? And I hope you'll forgive me if, out of loyalty to Carroll and my presentation this afternoon, I invite you to come watch that so I can answer this more fully.
And John, did you want to say something about the adaptation mitigation kind of continuum?
Yeah,
I cut you off there.
I think your point is a really important one, and I just want to spin it in a slightly different way. So, in a sense, your question could reasonably be posed. You know, this whole survey is about adaptation. Where was mitigation in this? And just for people, just to be completely clear, what we're talking about when we say mitigation, we mean reducing greenhouse gas emissions in the future to reduce warming. And the truth is, it is in there, and it's hidden in a very important place. I think it's important to acknowledge. So when we told our respondents, scientists' best guess is sea level rise will be 4 feet over 100 years, but it could be as much as 7, and it could be as little as 1. That range of uncertainty partly reflects scientists' uncertainty about what mitigation efforts will be implemented in the next 100 years and what impact that will have on world temperature. So in other words, if a little gift could show up in the mail for the scientific community saying, guess what, we can tell you, here's what's going to happen to world temperature over the next 100 years. Now, tell us what's going to happen to sea level rise. They would say, okay, I can answer that, and I'll answer it with a smaller band of uncertainty around my predictions. But in the absence of that envelope, I'm widening it because I don't know how society is going to react in the mitigation arena. So I think your point is exactly right, that mitigation and adaptation are inevitably interlinked. And what looks like scientific uncertainty that maybe the public would think of as sort of the fault of the scientists, it's not that they can't predict what's going to happen in the world as much. It's that they can't predict what people are going to do.
Well, I guess just what I was interested in the questions.
Is the mic
Microphone?
around? Oh, it's right behind you.
What I was interested in the question is, if you're a person that is willing to support building a, let's say a $10 billion infrastructure investment to stave against sea level rise, would that person also be interested in investing $10 billion in renewable energy, R&D, or whatever? I mean, can we trace a correlation between the precautionary person in adaptation and the precautionary person in mitigation?
John, can you repeat the question just briefly?
Yes. So the question is the degree to which there is commonality in the public, and let me oversimplify it by dividing people into two groups. Maybe the people who like the idea of preventing harm from climate change, and also, because they see that harm coming, like the idea of trying to prevent the harm from happening in the first place by reducing emissions, and other people who say, nah, we don't need to reduce emissions, and why would we prepare? I'm just not interested in any of this. And we have no way from this survey to know whether those are two distinct groups or whether views of prevention are sort of orthogonal to or separate from views about adaptation. And especially in the health arena, there's very interesting work that not everybody's into taking preventive steps to promote their own health. And it's a challenge for health professionals, as you know, to convince people to do things that would be effective preventive strategies, even though when people get sick, they're happy to do things to try to solve the problems.
Yes.
Evan Lehman with Climate Wire. There seems to be some pretty clear conflicts in the survey in terms of who should pay for adaptation measures and reality on the ground in New York City, for example. So to Cass, has the city sort of looked at strategies about how you yourselves could pay for some of these efforts, and would you be willing to increase tax rates, for example, to do so?
Well, I can't speak to whether specific, for example, I know in this budget we don't have tax increases on the table, period, at this point. But where we are right now is the city just received $1.7 billion in community development block grant funding. We just got the first tranche of that from HUD, and we are roughly allocating up to $400 million for what we're still developing as resilience investments that could range from programs to help people at an individual homeowner level to potential coastal protections, the the dunes, the beach replenishment that people seem to not want, and a whole menu of things. So, but there's no question that it is going to be a combination of individual responsibility for investment in rebuilding and public investment. I think if you look at the infrastructure investment that the city is making, there are a number of fundamentally climate resilience investments that are being made by the city on behalf of New Yorkers. For example, there's the green infrastructure plan that I mentioned. There is also a filtration plant for 300 million gallons of water a day that New York City is going to turn on basically within a month or two. Now, why is that a resilience investment? Well, we have 568 billion gallons of water in storage in our watershed. Now, because of the increased frequency of storms in the watershed, the usability of some of the different reservoirs where that storage is has decreased over time. We had large portions of the water system that were basically out of commission for months because we don't filter the water supply, which is a good thing because it's some of the best water in the world. With this plant, which you could have said, well, I've got 568 billion gallons, I don't need the other 300 million, I'm just going to take a chance. And we're not taking that road. This is a $3 billion plant that is going to make available to us 300 million gallons a day, if we need it, additional water supply. Now, that is a massive public investment in climate resilience / adaptation. People don't always think about it that way. We think about it that way. I think that the overall, though, some resilience, like green infrastructure investment, we now are making an investment so that every right-of-way investment that basically our Department of Transportation makes is going to include some green infrastructure element, some permeability element to deal with stormwater. Those are the kind of things that increase at the margins the incremental cost of building, but over time you can show that they will ultimately save, whether it's from regulatory regime or the damages that to water quality that additional storms and climate can cause. So it is going to be a mix of public and private investment.
Carroll?
I just wanted to mention that based upon conversations and briefings that we've had with the reinsurance industry, for example, on this point, one of the things that we know is that they are calling for increased codes, and that's going to be really, really critical and something that they're going to be looking for certainly at the state and local levels, and wanting federal support with regard to strengthened codes as well, because this is going to be very important in terms of thinking about how they protect their investments, and also keep premiums under control. And so I think that it is going to be a whole series of things in terms of different players who are going to be involved in setting forth both what, who should pay and under what kinds of conditions, but so that it's, again, a situation, I think, of how mitigation and adaptation definitely come together.
Okay. I think we have time for one more question. There is one.
Do we have one? Oh, there you go. Many of the rest of the world has already kind of put a price on carbon. What do you think the chances are of actually having that kind of regulation in America?
Not for me to answer.
Uh-oh.
Maybe a different panel, but Carol's going to take a go at it.
What I can tell you is that obviously it's a very, very tough question. Who knows? Although obviously we are seeing all sorts of externalities with regard to our current patterns of use of fossil energy, and everything in terms of thinking about climate impacts to public health to security, a lot of different kinds of impacts that are currently not in the price of carbon. And as you correctly point out, many other places around the world are moving in that direction, including China. And I think it clearly is being talked about. So it is an option that people are discussing on Capitol Hill, and I think in many different places around this country and in this and here in Washington. So we have to figure out how we are going to address issues. This clearly is a possibility that could be worked into the whole policy frame. So stay tuned.
All right. On behalf of the Stanford Woods Institute for the Environment and the Center for Ocean Solutions at Stanford University, I'd like to thank our panelists and our survey research teams.